Okay, everybody, welcome back to another edition of The Hard Sell. I think you're really going to like our guest this week, Mike Zani, best-selling author of The Science of Dream Teams, current CEO of Predictive Index. And Mike's got quite an interesting background. At one point, he was the coach of the U.S. Olympic sailing team. And after that started, I guess you would refer to yourself as a search fund entrepreneur, where you have sort of found companies and you essentially sort of refounded them. Ledco was one, ShapeUp was another one. And then for almost the last 10 years now, you've been CEO of Predictive Index, which was a family-run business for many, many years. And I'll let you say a little bit more about that. Mike and I are in a CEO group together, so I have a little bit of inside baseball here. But Mike, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here with you, Joel. The hard sell. Is it okay if I soft sell stuff, or do I have to only hard sell?
Either way, we accept both. Style points for a hard sell normally, but the soft sell is also good. Maybe just for folks that aren't as familiar with Predictive Index, just tell us a little bit about Predictive Index and the mission of the company and what you guys are about there.
Yeah, Joel, thank you for the really flattering intro. When we bought our first company at Ledco, we became clients of the Predictive Index, and we used it as a tool. And back then, it was just a behavioral assessment, and it was barely software. It was sort of, you would categorize it as like an online surveying tool. But it was founded in 1955, and it used to be done in pencil and paper. But we bought the company in 2014, so almost 10 years ago, and have turned it into a technology company. It was a science-based company, but building software tools and really automating a lot of the processes around what we call talent optimization. So it's a lot of pre-hire stuff, make sure you get the right people, but a lot of post-hire stuff to make sure that you're building and architecting teams the right way and working with interpersonal dynamics as well as, performance and engagement. So we call it a talent optimization platform, but we sort of all things people, and we're trying to get business out of the Stone Ages with respect to how they manage their talent and get them a little closer towards sports, which is 30 years ahead of business in this game we play.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and I think it's the type of thing where sales has moved, sort of followed maybe a little bit of a similar journey where it's been sort of, dark arts for a period of time. And now with sort of modern software platforms and a wealth of data, it's become much more precise and much more scientific. But I think one area where we're still maybe a little bit behind on the sales game is actually using some of these tools that are available for understanding a person, at least at a high level, and applying that into the process. And so I'm curious, from what you've seen across the industry and across your customers, like what if somebody was using tools like this to optimize their sales hiring process? Maybe just tell us a little bit about what that would look like.
You really have to understand your sales process to be able to answer that correctly. Because there's big differences in different types of sales processes. You have super technical sales where formality, which is one of the dimensions that we measure, which thinks about rules and attention to detail, would need to be really high, because you're probably talking to a buyer on the other side who demands that. And it's important for the salesperson to sort of match their buyer's needs with respect to that. So if whether it's, are you talking a highly technical sale? Are you talking a relationship sale? Are you talking high pressure sale versus a low pressure sale? And I want to give you an example. We've done like 450 construct validity studies on outcomes using behavioral science. And I would say 50 to 60% of those happen to be in sales, because you have the best data and analytics with respect to typically quota. Mm-hmm. And my favorite example is there's a jewelry store chain. They have about 125 jewelry stores across the country. And they wanted us to measure quota attainment with respect to our behavioral science. And we were able to come up with pretty predictably a model for them to hire towards. And for every standard deviation that the dominance drive went up, there was $144,000 more quota attainment with like a $40,000 standard deviation. And they're like, wait a minute. So why are I not hiring the most dominant people I can? And we're like, well, you should. And then there was slightly less predictive was impatience. And we also picked up other things that weren't measured by behavioral science, like tenure and full-time status versus part-time status. So we gave them an entire hiring process, like hire these type of people, measure your current part-time employees who have these profiles and make them full-time, and really retain these profiles vis-a-vis these profiles. So if you really understand your sales process, you can use behavioral science and science in general and your own data and analytics, to come up with a sort of master profile that you might want to hire towards.
And so is that I've heard people do it where you might find like a set of your top performers, and then you sort of profile those people, and then that becomes sort of the standard. It sounds like you could also, though, just sort of start with a blank slate and do one of these studies like you're talking about, where you're sort of looking for the overall patterns and saying like what ends up being predictive.
The only problem with just taking a handful of your high performers and using that as the profile is your N is too small. You're unless you're looking at an N of 25, 50 people, you're not going to get, science. You're going to get bias towards that process. So we suggest people don't do that. We'd rather have them use our construct validity studies and use those as models, because we work with a group like Nissan that has 3,500 salespeople. That's an N that's healthy, right, and will really give you data and analytics. If not, we give you other tools to understand your sales process. We give you additional surveys that say, tell us about the behavioral demands of this role. We actually let high performers in the role participate in that process since they know it well. And we do look at the top decile, the top quartile performers, but we don't just base it purely on that, because if your N is too small, you're gonna get potentially a bad benchmark.
Right. So let's say we've gone through this study, we understand we've sort of figured out the type of role that is, or the types of sort of psychographic indicators that are going to be successful in this role. And now, so we feel good about that. Now we want to use it in the hiring process. How does one do that? Like, at what point in the hiring process do you introduce a tool like this?
So I'm going to go to my manufacturing days. When you manufacture, you test parts as early in the process as you can. You do not take bad parts and put them, add value to them and put them into your machine or your motor or whatever it is you're building. So if you take that same application, you want to move it as early in the process as you possibly can. And not every company is willing or able to do that as early in the process as would like. We use our best practices. You basically get a 10-minute phone screen before we send you behavioral and cognitive analytics. And that's pretty much as early in the process as we feel works for us. But it really is, you want to make sure that you're spending your time, your valuable managers and hiring managers' time on high potential candidates.
So it's sort of a trade-off between there's some cost to sort of delivering the assessment versus there's some cost to your manager doing a bunch of phone screens for people that ultimately are probably not going to be the right fit. You maybe could have figured that out early.
You got to figure it out early. But there are some roles like sales, which have narrow behavioral criteria and they're well defined. And not every sales position, but many, versus there are positions like product where behavior is not predictive at all. And cognitive is more predictive. Where in sales, behavior is highly predictive, even more so than cognitive, unless you have a very complicated sales process. Say if you were selling to Cisco Systems in the 90s when they were inventing the internet, you needed high cog to do that particular sale.
Yeah, we sometimes a lot of times we talk on the show here about like particularly in the new company or tech company journey that the founder has to do a lot of the selling on whiteboards first, and then you sort of progress to PowerPoint selling, and you eventually ideally progress to sort of Adobe Acrobat selling where you like the process and the system is down. I imagine that sort of follows that same idea where the behavioral things start to trump some of the cognitive ones over time.
Yeah, it certainly does. And also the repeatability and the cost of your product. I mean, when you're buying Cisco's, I'm going to go buy 1,000 Cisco switches, to run the backbone of XYZ. That's an expensive proposition. Versus if you're buying, dental supplies on a recurring basis, and the person comes by every 2 weeks on a route, and you decide to add a new paste. I mean, it's really like, whatever, just drop it off. I'll try it.
Right.
If you talk about the risk of the sale, which is an important thing. When we get to the behavioral science, when you start really understanding it, what you're talking about is the reason we wanted high dominance, low patience. And we also do measures for risk. If you think about the sales process, most salespeople are highly compensated on a percentage basis on variable comp, which means you have to be risk tolerant. You have to be comfortable with that uncertainty. You have to be comfortable with people saying no. You have to be impatient to keep driving the volume up, where you are naturally motivated by the units, that you're willing to drive that. So part of the nature is just how we compensate salespeople. It's variable, it's risky. They have to be really self-driven. That we've said, because we want these performance-based pay programs, there are certain individuals who can exist in that. Doesn't mean they're the only individuals, but risk is easy to measure psychometrically, but is really hard to measure risk tolerance in other ways. And I use as an example, I courted my wife for 1.5 years before I asked her to marry me. Fortunately, she said, "I'll marry you." We went to marital counseling, and the counselor was asking us questions about financial risk. And I had no idea how she was going to answer these questions. And it turns out she answered them very differently than I did. I'm like, wait a minute, I courted you for 1.5 years, got on my knee, asked you to marry me for the rest of my life, and yet I didn't know risk. So why don't you use a 6-minute assessment? Because it's a really important predictor of sales performance, and you just can't observe it very easily.
Right, and you've tested this across enough people, across enough environments that you feel confident that this is going to get, like, you're not going to get tons of sort of false positives and spurious sort of measurements here. I could see that being one of the objections.
Actually, you do get false negatives. So you will not hire someone who would have been a great salesperson at your company, but you will also get you'll get more positives as a percent of your total
Fewer
hires.
false positives, maybe.
Yeah, fewer false positives, and just a higher percentage of positives. And that's what you want. You're playing a numbers game. And I mean, this is when you draft in sport, they're playing a numbers game. They don't know that if you redrafted three years after, you'd change your draft by knowing how they actually performed in the environment. But we're really talking about how to draft talent into your organization in a high probability.
Right.
You have to understand the benchmarks. What type of profiles will be successful in our specific sales environment. And you may even have bifurcated sales. You may have hunters, doing the landing. You may have people who are really focused on expansion. You might even call them client success. And there's a much more relationship, and it's much more technical, because they're actually answering, details on the product that go beyond the initial land. That you'll have different profiles in your organization, and world-class sales teams are doing this at a high level, where they Each of the different sales roles are different. And you might even have engineering-based sales or technical sales where they come in, engineering support to support sales. That's still a sales role. You know, it's an engineering-based role, but it's still a sales role, and they have to understand how this ties together. Or the quarterback, the person they're leading the sales process as the facilitator, but 4 or 5 other people are doing the actual pitches in each of their domains. That quarterback role is very different than most sales roles. It's more of a collaborator than it is the dominant driver that you see typically in closing.
Yeah, that's right. We tend to see that depending on the type of role that you're in and the type what you're selling, there are so many variables that can determine like what is sort of that optimal profile. And let's say now that you sort of have the profile, you have some you've got some assessment as part of your hiring process. So now you know a little bit about this person. The person shows up, now they have a manager, now you're trying to drive performance. How do you use insights that you would get from a tool like this then to actually help a person succeed once they've sort of made it in the door?
Yeah, so stylistically, so you brought them on board. Now you get to observe them in practice. You're going to use a lot of tools. You're going to use tools like Gong to talk about talk time and track certain words and phraseologies that you need to do. So I mean, obviously, there's going to be a huge amount of coaching. Some of that coaching is going to come down to style, and you can, even though you want dominant people. And when we measure dominance, that doesn't mean you should have a dominant sales process. So it says, how do you take a dominant person, which is predictive of success, and yet teach them to moderate that? Because if they just come in with the dominant club, they're not going to be successful. So you want, dominant is a tricky word. Dominant measures your willingness to put your thumbprint on things, how much you tolerate conflict, how much you like your own ideas put into practice. Those things are all healthy for the sales process, but if you just confuse it and say, I'm going to be the most dominant person on this call or in this room or of any of the people who are in the subset that they're considering, you're not going to win. So your sales managers are using these tools to help people modify themselves to be successful in environments. And you'll also get to people who, obviously people are doing a lot of pain probes and asking a lot of questions. You'll get people who aren't very verbal. And you're like, okay, I'm dealing with someone who's really introverted. Or you'll get someone who really reacts negatively to maybe even a semi-dominant concept. And you realize they're the opposite. And you have to really roll it back. And this all comes from coaching, and the sales managers have to understand the behavioral science at a really high level. Now, our sales manager, his name's Jim Spiritalozzi. I actually wrote about him in the book, talking about his style. But he actually he's big about talk time, and he really wants talk times in the 30% range. That he's actually hiring low extroverts, or what most people would call introverts. On our style, on our system, we call it low extroversion. And he wants other companies to hire the high extroverts. They interview really well, they pitch well in practice pitching, but they talk too much, and they're not good at asking questions and doing pain probes. So you really got to get the sales manager's got to be a total pro at this.
It's interesting, and it sort of makes me wonder, to the extent that you get people that are comfortable with these concepts and start to use them more, whether it's from introspection to try to get better or to work with others, like to what extent this actually could apply in the sales process itself. Now, obviously, you can't send your customer an assessment, or like you probably can't. But are there sort of fundamental concepts here that once people get used to this, that they can maybe read a situation better, or they might be able to understand, a little bit more, like get some intuition about how a customer might be, and then tailor their approach?
Yeah, the more familiar you become with any framework, behavioral framework, what you do is you can listen for cues and clues to see what the person may or may not be. You don't need perfect accuracy because you're not hiring them for the next 5 years. You're trying to sell something to them. So you're willing to have, an incorrect read because you're not doing a scientific read, you're doing a biased assessment. But we actually coach our salespeople in how to listen for those cues and modify themselves. You get someone who's very data driven. They ask ROI questions. They look for proof. They're looking for studies. They're looking for data to back that up. And you better not come to the second half of that call, or if you get it, a second call without having a lot of data.
Mhm.
You understand this, and you understand when someone's impatient. They're like, yep, got it, next, and they're driving the call because they're so you understand how impatient versus patient they are. You really need to tease these things out if you're going to make your trade sales and you want to be an artist at that trade or a
Yeah,
craftsperson.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and how much of this do you think is, to the extent that you talked a lot about managers being very, very good at this, do you get a sense that managers who are very good at this then can sort of coach up their teams more effectively in this, or is it the sort of thing where, somebody could just sort of self-study this on their own and get pretty good at it?
You can do on your own. It's less frequent and harder to do. You really create these cultures. You've got a sales team who buys into this, and you create 100 of these people who believe in this and carry it forward with them to other roles, and you'll see that migrate through a community, a sales community. And the Jim Spertolozzi, the guy I mentioned earlier who runs our sales process, he's our senior vice president of revenue. He came from Black Duck, and Black Duck was a PI client, and it was no accident that we hired him from Black Duck. And a bunch of people left Black Duck and they brought PI with them to other places. And once you use behavioral science successfully, you will use it as a tool, not the only tool, but as a tool that you bring with you. To do it on your own, it takes that it's like giving yourself, the GED or a college degree on your own. It takes a special character to have the willingness to fight through and do it on your own, because really it's not as much the manager. The manager starts the process, but our best coaching comes peer to peer. When someone who's been in sales for 2 years tells the newbie how to be successful because they're the top quota attainer, they're like, I'm listening to what Janet said. She kills it, and I want to be like Janet. And not in 2 years, I want to be like Janet now. So they're going to listen to their peers. So you create that culture is the easiest way to get it inculcated into your organization.
Are we? So we've mostly talked about all the positives of building this type of a capability within your company. Are there things to know to sort of be careful of when you're going to try to move a little bit further down this path of being more quantitative with how you approach the human element?
One thing is, I think since sales roles tend to be some of the most narrow in business. Call centers can also be narrow.
Mm-hmm.
They're really jobs that have narrower focus and high repeatability. If you think about manufacturing, if you're gonna do one job on a manufacturing line, you can imagine the behavioral profile gets pretty narrow for that. So one of the things that we get concerned about is pattern bias. So if the sales team they all look similar, they're all this style, this behavioral style, and they're all like, yeah, we're this, and they're like, wow, that sales crew is thumping all the same in a harmonic that is really noisy in the organization, and not just physically noisy, but you also have to say that you don't just have to be that to be successful at this organization as a whole. That I think it's unfortunate when you bring these tools in. It helps you hire better. It helps you talk about differences. It helps you communicate with each other. But if it creeps to the point of pattern bias, where people who are the wrong pattern, they're like, wow, I don't feel like I'm This is a very inclusive environment for me. And you can see that happening, especially when it's used incorrectly, too extremely. And that's really the downside. And it's the responsibility of whoever is sort of like the chief cultural person in the organization to be really close to that and jump on that stuff right away. Because the same thing happens with locker room talk, or the same thing happens with swearing, or maybe it's drinking, or other things that might get root and then be cultural, that you might be like, no, we don't really want that to take hold here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, sometimes I think the other challenge is, sales by its nature ends up being a thing that's easily celebrated. And it's like, oh, we just got the big client, or, revenue went up. I think it's oftentimes easier to celebrate those things than what some of the other departments do. And so I could imagine a world where you get that group disproportionately celebrated and they're all kind of similar, where people are probably like, well, I could, obviously if I'm going to get recognized and be ahead here, I must have to be like, one of these types.
We do something differently, and we suggest other companies, you need positions in your organization where you can get behavioral diversity in the organization. That even though we use it as our user support, or what most people call a call center.
Mm-hmm.
Where, while we could say we're only going to hire A+ call center profiles, we don't do that. We do it on purpose to add some diversity, because those people will stay in the call center role for 6, 9, 12, 18 months, and they go, hey, I love this company, I love the mission, I love the product. I'm not sure call centers where I want to end my career. Can I try something else in the organization? And they go to different places. They go to client success, they go to product, they go other places in the organization and have really healthy careers. So every company needs a place where they can bring in good raw material that is not homogenous, that's heterogeneous, behaviorally, cognitively, and on a lot of different dimensions, and feed the organization in that way.
Yeah, it's an interesting approach, both to building diversity and also to building a high performing culture. And I've definitely seen this work across a number of different companies that I've been involved in. So we're unfortunately running out of time here today, but if people wanted to learn more about Predictive Index and more about this sort of approach to building and managing teams, what are some ways they can do that? Or
they can certainly come to predictiveindex.com, and they can trial. We have a freemium hire product that they can trial. They can take the behavioral assessment themselves just to see what it's like. They can create a job and assess candidates against that job, all in the freemium stuff. So they can do a lot of stuff without even having to talk to someone. There's a lot of learning content as well, and they can get access to a lot of those validity studies. But certainly we'd obviously love to talk to them if they want to get deep dive into their own specific sales process and how they do things. And if they ever want to know more about myself, they can go to dreamteams.io. They can take another assessment there, or the same assessment there, and learn more about the whole discipline of talent optimization.
Well, there you have it, everybody. So would definitely encourage you to take advantage of those resources that Mike laid out. And Mike, great to have you on the show again.
Joel, it's great to be here. Love spending time with you, and it's a great topic, the hard sell.
The hard sell. No, I didn't detect any soft sell. So maybe there was some. But
I went a little harder.
We'll have to analyze the tape later. We'll analyze the tape. See what it says. All right. Thanks, Mike. We'll see ya.
Thank you, Joel.